In the summer of 1981, a small software company in Seattle was about to pull off one of the most audacious moves in the history of American business. Not by inventing something revolutionary, not by outcompeting a rival in the marketplace, but by buying a product for $50,000 that they did not own, relicensing it to the most powerful technology corporation on the planet, and never telling that corporation the whole truth about where it came from. The corporation was IBM, the product was DOS, the company was Microsoft, and the man behind it all was a 25-year-old named Bill Gates. Within a decade, that $50,000 transaction would make Gates the richest man on Earth. It would lock 1 billion personal computers into a single operating system, and it would destroy the man who actually wrote the code, a programmer named Tim Patterson, without Tim Patterson ever seeing more than a fraction of what his work was worth. That story has never been fully told. But here is the part that makes it darker than most people realize, and I will get to that in a few minutes. Here is the number that changes everything: $50,000. That is what Microsoft paid for QDOS in July of 1981. QDOS stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System. It was written by a programmer named Tim Patterson at a small Seattle company called Seattle Computer Products. Gates and Microsoft did not write a single line of that original code. And here is what that $50,000 became. By 1993, DOS was installed on over 100 million computers worldwide. By the mid-90s, Microsoft was generating revenues of over $5 billion per year. The company that started with a $50,000 licensing deal became, at its peak, the most valuable corporation in the history of the world. But the number that should stop you cold is this one: Tim Patterson, the man who actually wrote the code that Gates licensed and sold to IBM, received a total of $1 million from Seattle Computer Products, the same company that sold the rights to Gates for $50,000. Patterson later joined Microsoft. He worked there for years, but he never shared in the empire that his code helped build. The ratio of what Microsoft made to what Patterson received is not even calculable in ordinary terms. And yet the transaction that started it all was entirely legal, which raises the question of how it was possible, and that answer starts about 5 years earlier in a Harvard dorm room. To understand what happened in 1981, you need to understand the world of personal computing in the mid-70s. Computers were not yet personal. They were large, expensive machines used by corporations and universities. The idea that an individual might own one was still science fiction to most people. Bill Gates and Paul Allen changed that perception in 1975 when they founded Microsoft. Their first product was an interpreter for the BASIC programming language, designed to run on the Altair 8800, the first commercially successful home computer kit. Gates was 19 years old. By 1980, Microsoft was a profitable and growing company, but it was not yet dominant. It sold programming languages and development tools. It had no operating system. An operating system is the foundational software that controls a computer's hardware and allows other programs to run on top of it. In 1980, the leading operating system for early personal computers was called CP/M, made by a company called Digital Research, run by a man named Gary Kildall. IBM was about to change everything. The company had decided it needed to enter the personal computer market quickly, before competitors locked it out. In late 1980, IBM approached Microsoft, not to build an operating system, but to provide programming languages for a new machine they were developing in secret. That machine would become the IBM personal computer, the IBM PC. But during negotiations, something significant happened. IBM asked Gates directly whether Microsoft could also supply an operating system. Gates said yes. He did not have one, but he said yes anyway. And then he went looking for one. And the place he found it is where the story gets complicated. What he found, and what he did with it, is something IBM did not fully understand until it was far too late. IBM's first choice for an operating system was not Microsoft. IBM went to Gary Kildall at Digital Research, the man who had built CP/M and whose operating system was already powering tens of thousands of personal computers. The meeting between IBM and Digital Research in the spring of 1980 is one of the most debated moments in technology history. What happened is disputed. Some accounts say Kildall was out flying his plane when IBM arrived. Others say his wife and business partner, Dorothy McEwen, refused to sign IBM's non-disclosure agreement without legal counsel. What is not disputed is this: no deal was made. IBM left Digital Research empty-handed. IBM went back to Gates. Gates did not say he couldn't deliver. Instead, Gates licensed an operating system called QDOS from Seattle Computer Products for $50,000, without telling IBM that he had just bought it from a third party days earlier. Seattle Computer Products had built QDOS specifically to run on Intel's new 8086 processor. Tim Patterson had written it in roughly 4 months, working at extraordinary speed. It was heavily inspired by Kildall's CP/M. Patterson himself later acknowledged studying CP/M's design documents, but it ran on the new Intel chip, and it was for sale. Gates bought it. Then he licensed it to IBM under the name PC-DOS, presenting it as Microsoft's product. IBM paid Microsoft a per-unit licensing fee for every IBM PC sold with the operating system. But the critical detail, the one that made Gates a billionaire and IBM ultimately regret the deal, was that Microsoft retained ownership of the software. IBM could use it, but Microsoft could license it to anyone else as well. That clause, buried in the contract, was the lever that moved the world, and within 3 years, IBM itself would realize what it had given away. But by then, it was already too late to take it back. The IBM PC launched in August of 1981. It was an immediate and massive commercial success. Within 18 months, IBM was selling more PCs than any other computer manufacturer in history. The machine became the standard against which all other personal computers were measured. But IBM had made one catastrophic architectural decision. By using off-the-shelf components, Intel processors, Microsoft software, IBM had built a machine that competitors could legally copy. Clone manufacturers in the United States, Taiwan, and South Korea began producing IBM-compatible computers. They were cheaper, often faster, and they ran the same software. And because Microsoft owned the operating system, every one of those clone machines needed a Microsoft license. Not an IBM license, a Microsoft license. IBM had standardized the personal computer industry, and Microsoft was collecting a royalty on every machine in it. By 1984, clone manufacturers were outselling IBM in its own market. By 1986, the clone industry was worth billions. By 1988, Compaq, one of the first major clone makers, had reached $1 billion in revenue faster than any company in American history at that point. Every clone computer that sold made Microsoft richer and IBM weaker. The company that had handed Gates his opportunity was being dismantled by the architecture it had built. And underneath all of it, underneath the press releases and the stock prices and the market share reports, there was a programmer in Seattle who had written the code that started it all, and who was watching the empire being built on the foundation he had poured. What happened to Tim Patterson is not just a footnote. It is the human truth of this entire story. And it is coming up next. Tim Patterson was 24 years old when he wrote QDOS. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He was a hardware engineer who had taught himself to write operating system code because Seattle Computer Products needed one to test their new processor board and could not find anything suitable to buy. He wrote it in roughly 4 months in 1980. He called it QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, because that was how he thought of it. It was functional. It was fast, and it was not meant to be the foundation of a global technology empire. It was meant to help his employer test circuit boards. When Seattle Computer Products sold the rights to Gates for $50,000, Patterson was an employee. He did not own the code. He had no claim on the sale price. He received nothing from that transaction. He later joined Microsoft in 1981, the same year the IBM PC launched. He worked there until 1982, then left, then returned for a second stint from 1983 to 1986. During those years, he watched DOS become the standard operating system for the entire personal computing industry. He watched the company he worked for become the most powerful software firm in history. In interviews over the years, Patterson has been measured and careful. He has said he has no hard feelings. He has said he understood the business, but he acknowledged the obvious, that the work he had done in those 4 months in 1980 had been worth more than he could have imagined, and that he had not been the one who captured that value. What makes this story so enduring is not the legal question. The transaction was legal. Gates bought the license fair and square from a willing seller. The question is something harder than legality. It is the question of how value is created and who gets to capture it. And that question, about software, about labor, about the rules of ownership in the digital economy, is more relevant today than it has ever been. Because what happened to Patterson with DOS in 1980 is happening right now to the people whose content, data, and creative work is being used to train artificial intelligence systems. The architecture is different. The legal framework is still being written. But the underlying dynamic, someone builds something, someone else packages it and captures the value, is exactly the same. That parallel is where the real conversation is, and we will get to it in a future video. Here is where the story gets more complicated than the villain narrative allows. Bill Gates did not simply steal DOS. The facts do not support that framing, and this channel will not use it. What Gates did was recognize an opportunity that others missed. Gary Kildall had the better product, the more established company, and the prior relationship with the personal computer market. He could have had the IBM contract. The reasons he did not get it are still debated, but the opportunity was real and he did not close it. Seattle Computer Products sold QDOS knowingly at a price they agreed to, with legal title transferring to Microsoft. Tim Patterson wrote the code as an employee, and under standard employment terms of the era, his employer owned it. None of these transactions were fraudulent. What Gates possessed that the others did not was an understanding of leverage. He understood that owning the software standard, not the hardware, not the brand, was where the durable power in the industry would reside. He structured the IBM deal specifically to preserve that leverage, and IBM's lawyers either did not catch the implication or did not think it mattered at the time. The optimistic reading of this story is that Gates was simply a better businessman. He saw what others did not. He moved when others hesitated, and the resulting wealth, enormous as it became, was earned through legal transactions and superior strategic vision. The pessimistic reading is darker. It is that the personal computing revolution was built, at its foundation, on a $50,000 transaction in which the person who created the core asset received almost none of the value that asset generated, and that the rules of intellectual property, software ownership, and corporate structure were written in ways that systematically separated creators from the wealth their creations produced. Both readings are true simultaneously. This is what makes the story worth understanding. It is not a simple morality tale. It is a window into the structural mechanics of how technology fortunes are made, and those mechanics have not changed as much as we would like to believe. In the summer of 1981, a 25-year-old in Seattle paid $50,000 for a piece of software, licensed it to the most powerful technology company in the world, retained the ownership rights, and built an empire. By the time IBM understood what it had agreed to, the clone industry had already replicated its hardware. The standard had been set, the leverage had shifted, and Microsoft was collecting a royalty on every personal computer sold on Earth. Tim Patterson wrote the code. Gary Kildall built the blueprint it was modeled on. IBM created the market, and Bill Gates captured the value. The next video in this series looks at what happened when IBM tried to fight back. In the late 1980s, IBM partnered with Microsoft to build a replacement for DOS called OS/2, a modern, powerful operating system that IBM believed would restore its control over the PC standard. Microsoft worked on it alongside IBM while quietly developing Windows on the side. When OS/2 was ready, Microsoft walked away and launched Windows 3.0 instead. IBM had been set up a second time by the same company. That story is, if anything, more instructive than this one. If you have been watching this channel because you feel like the technology industry has not always been honest with you about Microsoft, about what Windows has become, about the alternatives that exist, then this channel is exactly where that conversation happens. Not for people who want outrage, for people who want the actual record. Subscribe if you want to be here when the OS/2 story comes out, because the way IBM lost the software wars the second time explains everything about why Windows still dominates today and why it may not forever.